The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. And now introducing 2023 Sine Fellow, the Honorable Mimi Walters.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Sine Institute Fellow Seminar. My name is Caleb Brown, and I am a graduate assistant here with the Sine Institute. On behalf of the rest of us at Sine, we are so pleased to have you here today, and thank you for coming to support our seminar series. The Sine Institute is a laboratory for university-wide collaboration and an incubator for policy innovation, convening the best and brightest in the public, private, academic, and nonprofit sectors, as well as journalism. The Institute is where the brightest minds engage to promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. It is where American University comes to convene, communicate, and collaborate. Today, we are honored to have Sine Fellow, the Honorable Mimi Walters, who will be later joined by a special guest virtually, Dr. Charles Orchip Stone. Mimi Walters is a former U.S. representative who represented California's 45th Congressional District in Orange County from January 2015 to January 2019. Ms. Walters served as the freshman and sophomore representative to the Republican-elected Leadership Committee for the 114th and 115th Congress, and has also served on the influential House Energy and Commerce Committee. Prior to her election to the U.S. House of Representatives, Ms. Walters served on the Laguna Niguel City Council and subsequently served in both the California State Assembly and California State Senate. She possesses a background in business, finance, and government, and currently serves as the Chief Commercial Officer for the Leading Edge Power Solutions, LLC. Her guest, Dr. Stone, who will be joining us here shortly, is a clinical forensics psychiatrist with over 25 years of experience working with patients who suffer from depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, panic, and PTSD. He is trained in both the clinical care of patients experiencing emotional challenges as well as the objective analysis of situations and legal areas which are impacted by a person's mental state. Ms. Walters has joined us here on campus at American University to discuss the U.S. mental health crises and potential solutions for the crisis that is facing the United States and the world. Through this issue, she will help navigate through the history, causes, and potential solutions available and the ways in which we can find consensus on this important health issue. Please give me a hand in welcoming the Honorable Mimi Walters.
Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome to this seminar. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm so grateful to have you all listen to me about the mental health crisis. In full disclosure, first time I'm teaching a course on mental health, so bear with me, you're all my guinea pigs here. But people have asked me, why is it that you're so interested in this particular issue? And really, quite frankly, it happened over a series of 3 events in my life over the last 10 years. The first event was my son. First of all, I have 4 children. I have 2 girls and 2 boys. I have a 30-year-old daughter, a 29-year-old daughter, a 28-year-old son, and a 26-year-old son. And my 28-year-old son when he was 18 years old and went off to college at Villanova University. His first week there, he didn't know what was wrong with him. He wasn't sleeping at night. He couldn't concentrate. He was having some erratic behavior. He was getting very frustrated. And so he went to see the counselor and said to the counselor, something is wrong with me. I don't know what it is. And the counselor said, well, what do you feel like, DJ? And he said, I want to hit something. And the counselor's all, great, okay. And this is not a violent child, by the way. So the counselor said, well, why don't you go sit in this room? I'm going to give you a pillow. And if you feel like hitting something, you hit this pillow. So he went into the room, and immediately she called my husband and me and said, you need to come pick up your son. We have a problem here. Now, I'm in the California State Senate at the time. We were right at the end of session. And when you're in the legislature and you're at the end of session, it is chaos. And I said to my husband, I said, I don't know if I can leave right now. And he said, don't worry, I'll handle it. And quite frankly, my husband is much better at handling adverse situations than I am. So he got on the plane, went to Villanova, went and saw my son, talked to the administrators. Fortunately, the college was great. They gave us a recommendation of a psychiatrist. My son went to see the psychiatrist, got him on some medication we thought was going to be good. He got through his freshman year. Then he started his sophomore year, and his sophomore year didn't go well. The school said, you got to come pick him up. He just is not focusing. We're having problems. He's not attending class. So the school said, we'd like you to have him take a leave of absence for a year. And if he gets the medical need, if he gets medical attention, he can come back the next year. So we brought him home for a year. And I said, okay, I said, DJ, you're not going to sit home for 1 year, not do anything. You're going to go to the community college and you're going to get a job. So that's what he did for a year. We got him some more treatment, talking to different psychiatrists and trying to get help for him. We got him what we thought was in a good place. He went back to school, finished his sophomore year. And then suddenly his junior year, he went completely downhill, spiraled downhill. He got arrested for public intoxication. We, at that point, knew we had such a serious problem that we had to convince him to check himself into a psychiatric ward, which he did at Bryn Mawr Hospital. It was there that DJ turned his life around. It was a situation where, fortunately, my husband and I could come visit him. His siblings were able to visit him, but there was one night when he was in the psych ward that he couldn't have any visitors, and we couldn't see him. And that's when he said to himself, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to get help, and I want to make sure I'm getting the right help. So what we did, and it was a situation where he had sort of had to come to it and realize he had to make the change. So we put him, after he got out of the hospital, we put him into an outpatient care program for several months. And the gal who ran that program was tough. I mean, he had to stop drinking. He had to make sure he was taking his medication. I mean, she was on him. And that turned his life around. He got on the right medication, and he was able to complete his education. He graduated from Villanova in 2018. He now is working at a company in downtown Los Angeles in the investment business. He has a new girlfriend, and he just called mom and said, I'd like you and dad to meet her. So we're having dinner with them next weekend. And I said to DJ, I said, did you tell your new girlfriend about your situation? And he said, you know, Mom, that was something that I wasn't sure when I should tell her. And I did tell her, and she turned to me and she said, is this something I need to be worried about? And he said, absolutely not. So the reason I'm telling you this story, not only because it impacted me, because as a mom, I had no idea what bipolar was. I had no idea of the symptoms. I was just in shock about what was happening. And it was a very difficult time for our family, but we got through it, and DJ's doing exceptionally well. The second event in my life was my mother recently passed away, but she was diagnosed many years ago with dementia. And my parents were married almost 70 years before they both passed. But to watch what my mom and what my dad went through, watching her slip away, dementia is like a slow death. And as a child, I was trying to help out as much as I could. And I would have to bathe my mom. I would change her diapers. Things, trust me, you don't want to have to do when you're the child to your parents. And I have to say that dementia is one of the worst diseases that a person can have. But God rest her soul, she and my dad are both in heaven now together, and that's sort of a saving grace for us. But I know my mom is a strong woman, a very nice and kind woman, and what she went through during her time having dementia, I think she would be horrified by some of the actions she had if she knew it. And that just breaks my heart as a child. So the third event in my life was 5 years ago. My daughter, who's now 30, came to me at the age of 25 and said, Mom, I met this wonderful guy. I am totally in love with this guy. But Mom, I just want you to know, he went to his first AA class at the age of 16. And I'm like, oh, great. You couldn't find somebody else who wasn't an alcoholic as a teenager, huh? And she says, no, Mom, but it's okay. It's okay because he was the first participant in a trial at NYU. And he took this compound called psilocybin, that compound in mushrooms. And after one treatment, Mom, he didn't want to drink anymore. He doesn't even consider himself an alcoholic. And so everything's okay. And I'm very suspect, right? Yeah, sure, yeah, sure. I mean, I had met the guy a couple times when I was in New York, because that's where they live. And then the pandemic hit. And my daughter came home to live with us. And she brought her boyfriend to live with us too, because she wasn't going to be separated from him. And we spent 6 months together. And that's when I knew that this treatment really worked. Because I could be having a cocktail and he'd be sitting right there and he had no cravings whatsoever. Didn't bother him that I was drinking. He doesn't go to AA. He doesn't have any follow-up. He doesn't even consider himself an alcoholic anymore. And that was the final sort of straw, I would say, that got me involved in this, because I thought, you know what, this treatment is something else. And I want to get more involved and see if we can't help make using psychedelics more accessible to more people. And so it's really because of those three events that I have sort of dedicated my life to helping see if I can't help make some good to help treat more people. Before we have our special guest, Dr. Stone, I want to just run through with you a few statistics here so you can all get an idea about this crisis that we're facing. And what mental health really is, it's mental health disorders are a wide range of conditions that affect the mood. That's what the definition is. And according to the National Institute of Mental Health, 1 in 5 adults experience mental health illness annually. The most common disorder in the US is anxiety disorder, which affects roughly 18% of adults. Major depressive disorder affects almost 7% of adults. Bipolar disorder and eating disorder is experienced by about 3%. Schizophrenia, 1% of adults in the US are affected by schizophrenia. And this is an alarming statistic. 10% of children have a mental health disorder. Here's another very alarming statistic. 1 in 7 people ages 12 and older suffer from substance use disorder. That's 1 in 7. And suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, which translates into roughly 48,000 people. Now, there's factors that contribute to the mental health crisis. Number 1, stigma. Okay, my generation, generations before me, no one wants to talk about mental health because it has a very bad stigma to it. Oh, what's wrong with you? You've got a mental health disorder. So that's one of the reasons. Access to care is another reason. We have a shortage of healthcare providers for mental health disorder. And it's only getting worse as the baby boomers continue to get older. Cost, of course, very expensive. A lot of people can't afford to get help. And then there's a lack of awareness. And people don't know the symptoms. It's kind of like with my son. My husband and I had no idea what the symptoms were. And you know what we found out later? We found out that our son used to smoke pot, which, by the way, I knew he smoked pot in high school, but I didn't realize how much pot he smoked. And he smoked pot to calm himself down. And when he was in high school, he'd start to kind of get hyper and and not focus. And he had a group of friends, that was his network of friends, that would help him and say, DJ, knock it off. And like, okay, okay. But he lost that support system when he went to college because it was a new environment. And that triggered the symptoms for him. And by the way, in bipolar disorder, what I've learned is that teenagers, the symptoms don't really manifest themselves until they're in their teenage years. And so it's very common to have kids who are starting off in college all of a sudden find out that they have bipolar disorder. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, that really has led to a lot more of anxiety and increased mental health. It's exacerbated the mental health crisis because you have more stress, more anxiety, and depression because people weren't sure what was going to happen. Real quickly, let's talk about the causes of mental health disorders, and then I'm gonna hand it over to you, Dr. Stone, because I know you're listening. So first of all, genetics. People have a family history, and of course, mental health disorders can be affected with people who don't have a family history of mental health disorder. Environment, stressful events such as death of a loved one, divorce, or financial problems. Childhood experiences such as physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, and life experiences also plays into this. Mental health disorders can also be triggered by traumatic events such as natural disasters, car accident, or violent crime. So there's a lot of external factors that play into the whole mental health disorder crisis. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Stone. And Dr. Stone had informed me, we've known each other for close to a decade now. He's a wonderful man, and he does a lot of work in the prisons. And so I wanted him to share not only his experience treating people who have mental health disorders, but also talk to us a little bit about what it's like to treat inmates, because we know the inmate population is a very large population in this area. So with you, Dr. Stone, thanks for joining us.
You're sure welcome. I'm probably going to take these AirPods out because I bet I get some background feedback, but we'll see. Well, maybe not. Actually, I can't hear myself at all, so that's perfect. First of all, I would like to congratulate each of you and also applaud you for diving into this topic and really putting yourselves kind of on the cusp of being in a real position to make very, very important fundamental changes. I think it's an exciting, there are a lot of exciting horizons in the world of mental health, and it is such fertile ground to make such an amazing impact on souls and lives. So great to see all of you there, and I know this will be a wonderful course for you. A little bit of background for me. I had, when I was in college, quite a bit of interest in psychology, to some extent, the sciences and medicine, law and political science. And so for me, finding my way into medical school and then doing a psychiatry residency and then a fellowship in forensic psychiatry really tied all of those things together. It let me use all of the emotional influences that I'd had, my understanding of biology, and my fascination with the law, and really try to chisel it into an area where I felt like I could make a difference to help enlighten. You know, forensic psychiatry, for example, is a large portion has to do with helping attorneys, helping judges to figure out sometimes the confusing path, or maybe even the confusing jungle of mental health issues. And when they get entangled in the legal system, it really becomes an oddly foreign language for most people to understand. And part of my role is to help clarify a lot of the things that judges, attorneys need clarification of in those situations. What I do at the prison, strangely enough, is treatment. So there's kind of a fundamental difference between traditional forensic psychiatry and clinical or treatment psychiatry. Treatment and clinical psychiatry, we're really working as advocates for the patients, trying to help them overcome certain barriers. In the forensic arena, the barrier that we're helping to be overcome is usually an understanding by the courts rather than involving ourselves specifically in the treatment. So I sometimes, my week sometimes will be occupied by two different hats. If we think about prison specifically, my interest in prison work had largely to do with my grandfather, who spent some time in prison. It was, I don't think, anything exciting, and it was long before I was born, but it was for tax evasion. But one thing that I grew up with was something that got instilled in me, and that was a desire to really help those who have oftentimes felt forgotten about. One of the things that I learned a lot from my grandfather was, these are souls inside these walls who have families, who have purpose, who have missions and things like that. And don't forget about those people. Part of what I try to do inside of those prison walls is really remind folks that they can still make positive impacts, whether that's on their community once they get out, whether it's inside the prison, maybe a kid who comes in for a 6-month term and has a chance at getting out. Somebody who is on a 7-year term may very well have a huge impact on helping that younger kid to go out and make different decisions and change lives. One of the things that I talk to a lot of guys about is just preparation. It's preparing for that day when you step out of this prison. And what's that going to be like for you? Who are the people that you need to heal relationships with while you're in here? Who are the people you need to contact about jobs? Where are the places that you need to go to seek forgiveness? What's the education that you need to seek? How do you want to strengthen your relationship with God while you're inside here? And really helping from the time, and we see people at the prison that I work at, we see people when they just come straight from their conviction. Probably 90% have spent some time in jail. Some of them are coming straight into a prison environment. But it's at the beginning of their term. So it's really trying to catch them as early as possible, helping them to understand that the time will go by, but that they have a wonderful opportunity to make such great use of the time so that that day comes when they do step out, they are more equipped to handle the life that they are stepping into. And I, rather than, and I use an example of 3 people typically. One is a person, and if today is February 21st, and I will tell people, I said, there are 3 people who got out of prison today. They all came in 1992. One spent the last 29 years jaded and bitter and angry at authority. One spent the last 29 years paying no attention to anything. And the other spent the last 29 years preparing for life outside. All 3 are out today, but one is very angry and bitter. One has no clue what he's going to do. And the third one is prepared. He's recaptured connections with his family, might have a job lined up, and things like that. So one of the huge things that we do is try to work on preparing folks for the time that they are going to get out. As I mentioned, correctional psychiatry is not traditionally what is thought of as forensics. But it does allow for interactions with attorneys and courts, sometimes in helping the attorneys or the courts understand when somebody might be more prepared for parole. So there are times when I will be asked to give an assessment of somebody's, readiness or fitness to be paroled perhaps early, or do they need to be put into a state hospital, something like that. So those are questions that come up, and that is sometimes where those areas of treatment and the more evaluative, objective forensic missions overlap a little bit. When I see somebody, it's really, for me, it's really important that I understand their family structure, trying to understand the educational background of the person, find out who the influences have been. And for so many, gangs often serve a very, rather familial role. That it serves as the role of family. So many of the folks that I see in prisons come from homes where there is not a male parent. They most have not completed high school, and most have fallen into some sort of substance abuse. In the area that I'm in, methamphetamine is probably the primary culprit, but we're starting to see more of the fentanyl and the heroines as well. But drug use for a lot of people becomes a way of connecting with their gang, with their friend group, with their peer group, with that group that serves that role of family. And so understanding that becomes so crucial in helping this person, because so often they don't have their own individual identity, or at least one that they are familiar with. And so that becomes a really crucial area to help the person to understand where things might have gone wrong for them. The treatments that we offer inside prison can be any number of things. It can be medication, it can be counseling, it can be different types of psychotherapies. On rare occasion, people get ECT, the electroconvulsive therapy, which historically has always seemed a bit barbaric, but strangely enough is probably among the safest treatments for a number of different conditions and one of the most effective. At our prison, primarily it's medication and psychotherapy that we use. And the conditions that we see are going to be anything from an impulse control problem, or somebody's aggression, whether that's driven by excessive hormones or a dysfunction in their brain, just causes them to act on impulse, and typically with aggression, maybe with intermittent explosions and things like that. We see a lot of mood disorders. So a bipolar condition, we see a lot of clinical depression, where it's just that lagging, apathic, no motivation, no drive. And with bipolar disorder, typically when we think about the classic symptoms anyhow, we're thinking about cycles between depression and the manic phases. And mania is typically thought of as somebody who doesn't sleep, doesn't feel like he or she needs to sleep. Mind is kind of racing, has all sorts of, very, copious amounts of grandiose ideas. I'm going to be the next lead singer of, Nirvana, and I'm going, and I have written all of these songs over the last 7 nights that I know are all going to be Grammy winners. And that will go on for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they will crash into a pit of depression where it's hard for them to climb out of bed. So often what happens is that the folks that we see inside the prison walls will have committed some kind of a crime during a phase of mania, and their guilt and their shame during their cycle into depression is so great that they even have contemplated suicide. We have several people that have attempted suicide. So again, helping people to manage those types of situations and those conditions is a huge part of what makes up correctional psychiatry. We see a lot of psychotic disorders. So psychotic disorder would be something like schizophrenia. Psychotic means basically a break from reality. Schizophrenia, I guess the term really means schizo, like a schism, and phrenia, which is a reference to the brain. So it's a break from the reality inside the brain. And so that's a person who either has really outlandish beliefs that, you know, there's a family of mice living inside my pen and they're coming out at night to, you know, infuse me with supernatural powers, or I'm hearing voices, you know, and most frequently when we hear about people who hear voices or hallucinate, we're hearing you're rotten, you're going to go straight to hell, you have no point. They're very negative things, and they're different than just the thoughts that all of us from time to time have, where we just want to pound our head. These are actually audible thoughts that only that person can hear, and frankly, only that person can explain. We see a lot of adjustment problems, people just coming into prison with, you know, profound hopelessness and difficulty adjusting to a prison environment. A lot of guilt, a lot of shame, a lot of, you know, embarrassment, feeling as though they've disappointed their family members, things like that. And those folks are oftentimes the ones that we have to be especially conscientious about when it comes to more impulsive suicide attempts, because they've gone from a place where they've lived a relatively normal life up until whatever this thing is that they've been convicted of. And now their freedom has been taken away. You know, their ability to make decisions on their own has largely been curbed. And they have, you know, in so many families brought shame to, you know, their parents, their wives, their husbands, things like that. So helping them deal with that humiliation and helping them to see beyond that is a huge, huge, huge part of what we do. You know, as we touched on a few minutes ago, anxiety disorders are extremely common and tend only to get worse coming into a prison environment. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which is an anxiety disorder, is huge. And so we have a lot of people who've dealt with all sorts of traumas, you know, been shot at, have shot other people, and all of those things frequently come back flooding into them. So when you hear a door slam in a prison, you can see and almost palpably feel that angst among so many folks because of these little micro traumas, and then the triggers that they have from their own trauma. So we deal a lot with post-traumatic stress disorder inside of that prison environment as well. We deal a lot with helping people who have maybe some cognitive problems. So helping them who may be more vulnerable to some vicious attacks, either manipulation or physical attacks from other more sinister inmates or unscrupulous inmates. So we spend a good chunk of time helping those folks as well. And then, you know, again, really helping them to understand that they still have purpose, that they still can find and identify and seek out their mission, reminding them that they truly have not been forgotten about. And one of the things that I tell people all the time is, you know, doing bad things does not make you a bad person any more than doing good things makes you a good person. But it's really what's the character and the nature of your heart and your motivation and your purpose, and what's the next step you're going to take in life. And that's so often when I've had people give me feedback years later after I'd seen them, they would say, those are the kinds of things that I heard from your mouth that helped me to reframe and rethink, so many of my perspectives, so many of my perceptions, and so many of my choices. Me personally, I try not to just make a living helping people who've been convicted of crimes. And what I mean by that is this, that several years ago, I made the determination that even if I was going to have an income generated by working inside of a prison, one of the things that I wanted to do with that income was go back into communities and help victims of crime as well. So we've done some work with human trafficking victims, do a lot of work with women's shelters, and things like that, whether it's donating time, donating money, helping them with their post-traumatic stress as well, as a way of kind of maybe helping to create a little bit of closure, but also helping just to nurse some of the wounds that that so often are really, really hard to heal. That's kind of the overview that I wanted to give you. And I didn't check the time, but hopefully I did okay on the time and left enough time for some questions and answers and feedback and things like that.
Thank you. I'll start it off, and then we really would love to have you all ask questions. You can ask them of Dr. Stone, you can ask me, whatever you feel you're compelled to do. But I'll start the first question, actually, Dr. Stone. Can you just share with us what has been the most, what's the most challenging part of your work, and what is the most rewarding? Because I could imagine that it can be so overwhelming working with inmates. And
sure,
we'd love your perspective.
Yeah, I think that sometimes the most challenging, and one of the things that I personally try to, I don't know, well, I was going to say I try to avoid it, but I don't know if I do. I think I do avoid it for the most part, but I don't know how much I try to, and that's knowing what the nature of their crimes are. Because if you have if somebody is sitting down in front of me and it turns out that he had, molested a half a dozen 6-year-old kids, it becomes really, really hard to separate that the emotional kind of the unpalatability or the disgust, the disdain, whatever word you want to apply there, and then treat the person. So one of the things that is among the more challenging things is trying to make sure that we do separate out those things, so that when we look at somebody, we don't see the person for what he or she has done. We see the person for what he or she can become. And that is a huge, huge thing, but it's probably among the more challenging things. I mean, there certainly are other challenging things. One is, when you have somebody who does impulsively, slice open their wrist or tries to hang themselves with, a bed sheet. Historically, psychiatrists and psychologists, anybody that works in the mental health field, we take the work pretty personally. And it's not always true that we do, but so often we look back when somebody has tried to hurt themselves, or when somebody, God forbid, kills themselves, and we go, what could we have done differently? And so often the answer is there's nothing. There's nothing that we could have known in this situation that would have changed the outcome. And I use the example of, if I did it right now and I just hit my head against this, the table, you guys would all say, geez, we didn't see it coming. Was there any way we could have known of it? And there's not sometimes. Sometimes there are. And I think that's when psychiatrists and psychologists have to be very, very diligent about being almost like, a good airline pilot. And that is making sure that we're not being cavalier about these evaluations, making sure that we're not just going, this guy will be fine. Oh, this guy will be fine. He's always talking about, wanting to jump off the tier, jump off the second floor onto the cement floor down below. But really being disciplined, diligent, and again, like that airline pilot who goes through a checklist, making sure that we're going through systematically, going, okay, did we take a close enough look at all of these things? Nobody ever knows what they prevent. We all love to talk about prevention. It's a wonderful thing to try to do. It's just that you never know if you prevent something. The only time you know is when we don't prevent something. So those are probably two of the more challenging things. The rewarding things are just what we were talking about. It's when somebody shows up at my office in Laguna Hills in California, 8 years ago, and after getting out of prison, and surprises me in the office and says, you know what, I'm out because of you, and thank God for you, and stuff like that. So it's when you see people making the kinds of change that are going to revolutionize not just their lives, but the lives of their family, their friends, a 7-Eleven worker who's not going to get bludgeoned because of something that this person did differently than what he or she might have done, if they hadn't made that adjustment in their life. So there's so many huge impacts that can be made. That is by far, I think, the most rewarding thing.
Thank you. Questions?
Yes, thank you very much for coming to talk on this important subject. My question is, of course, working with these inmates, you have your own mental health to consider, and you have to take care of yourself. Is the approach that you use to take care of your own mental health working in this field any different than how us students or any other member of the public would take care of their mental health? Do you do something different?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, and I guess in some, I don't know, I think is the answer. Because the things that probably all of us learn to do over the course of our lives that tend to help us, we generally do because it does tend to help us. Ideally, and again, we can go and use one of the inmates as an example. That inmate feels more comfortable, before he becomes an inmate. He feels more comfortable going and hanging out, smoking, a meth pipe and hanging out with his gang friends, and going on a turf war. He feels more comfortable because he feels more connected. So ideally, the things that any of us do are going to help us feel more whole, more connected, but not tend to lead to destruction, either of somebody else or of ourselves. So, I'm, and Mimi knows this. I mean, her brother is the person who gets me. He said he runs a tennis shop, and tennis is probably the hobby that I take on most. It's the thing that helps me to burn off as much aggression or frustration or stress or anxiety as possible. And we were joking about how I just need to get a racket from her brother that doesn't keep hitting the ball into the net, and then all my problems would be solved. So I think it's, we find different ways. And what I tried to help to encourage people to do is really sort of look at the different spheres of your life. I sometimes use an example of, it's like a paper plate that you take to a picnic. If you overload it with beans on one side, it's just going to tip over and you're not going to get beans or anything else. But if what you do is you create some balance, you have some beans on one side, you have a little bit of corn, you have, whatever else, you got some ribs on one side. And it's similar to how we want to create balance in our lives. If I overload my life with work, it's going to tip over to one side and the other, everything's going to fall apart. But if I've managed to create enough balance with my physical health, with my emotional health, with my spiritual life, with my academic pursuits, with my financial situations, with my, social, the social needs, and create enough balance in all of those areas and do my best to do that, finding a variety of different ways to do it, then it probably doesn't become a lot different than anything that anybody else would do. It just is a matter of figuring out what those things are. Now, I mean, I might have some advantage in knowing that, certain things work better than certain other things, but not a lot of advantage there.
Hi, thanks for speaking to us. Based on your experience, to what extent do you think that earlier intervention could be beneficial as a tool to, reduce violent acts in general?
Huge, huge, huge. And I'm so glad that you mentioned it, because I probably would have forgotten to come back to that. But that is one of the most important things. Now, when does that happen? Nobody knows, because it's not, I don't know that we're ever going to be able to, take a 2-year-old out of somebody's home and put them into a home where, people think, oh, well, this is going to be a good home. But your question is an amazing, wonderful one, because again, it's when people wind up in prison, they've had, 18 to 25 years, if not more, of having typically very disrupted family structures. And the root winds up being probably education. So much comes from just fragmentation in that nuclear family. Again, as young, innovative thinkers, those very well might be some of the things that you help to construct, beautiful, amazing solutions for. But it is absolutely vital to start young, because again, one, it's hard to change something when somebody's been doing it for 25 years. But the other thing is that 25 years, there's oftentimes a long wake of destruction. There's a lot of destruction in their wake. But yeah, early intervention is a huge thing, critical thing. Figuring that out is going to be a fun and amazing challenge.
Yeah, I guess idealistically, if you could put like that hat on, in terms of early intervention, I guess like you've spoken to so many people who have committed these crimes. Do you think that like education or like the school system is a good way to kind of confront those challenges of the trauma that they're facing, or is it having more access to care like we were kind of talking about earlier?
Well, I think it's a few of those things, and certainly care, access to care is certainly important. Getting to that care that is accessible is probably huge. I mean, again, if a kid has a fragmented family, he or she may not have a parent to take him to that care, even if that care is accessible. One of the jobs that I loved doing, go back, 15 years, and it was a homeless outreach program in south part of Los Angeles, and there we would work with homeless people who had also mental health issues, helping them to get treatment, helping them to get into homes and things like that. Again, that's not early intervention, because those also are folks who've had 25 years or so of long patterns of dysfunction. So the education for early intervention, the education is going to be important. The access to care is certainly important, but somehow figuring out how to keep families intact, I think, is going to be huge. I think that the unfortunate thing is that there are genetic links that come with so many of these things, but the genetics also are oftentimes paired with environmental, and it goes back to the age-old question of nature versus nurture. And virtually always, in almost every circumstance, it's a combination of the two. Sometimes there are things that are purely environmentally driven. Sometimes there are things that are purely genetically driven. You know, the same grandfather that spent time in prison, I never saw him take a lick of alcohol, but I heard about him, you know, describing himself as an alcoholic. My mother has wrestled with problems with alcohol. My cousin has wrestled with problems with alcohol. Me, I can drink or not drink. It makes, you know, I don't have like an unquenchable impulse to drink. My cousin, if he gets a drink this close to his mouth, he's not going to stop until the next morning. And so it's interesting because we did have, I mean, he and I both had similar environments growing up. We had, you know, similar genetic makeup. But his experience has been, you know, completely different than what mine or my sister's has been. And frankly, even his own brother, but not a lot different than his mother, my mother, and our grandfather. Figuring out some of those things, I think will be, you know, is also going to be huge in helping to really target the interventions that could, you know, really save a generation.
I had a question sort of similar in terms of education, and I just wanted to direct it to Ms. Walters. You mentioned that 10% of children struggle with mental health disorders, and I guess amid a lot of kind of hot debate right now, not only about parent choice when it comes to schools, but also disproportionate resources in schools. Do you think that in navigating U.S. mental health crises, more attention should be put toward parent education and resources on mental health, or school education, school mental health resources, or both?
Well, I think it's probably a combination of both. I think as a parent who, as I mentioned, went through a son with bipolar and not knowing what the signs were. I think if parents can be more educated on what the signs are for their children, then it's going to be helpful for everyone. Because if I had known what some signs were, there might have been something I could have done and I could have been aware of it. So I think in education from both perspectives would be very helpful. I think you also get into probably a little bit of an issue if teachers start to, you know, they might see signs and then bring the parents in, but sometimes it might go too far because then the parents are like, oh, not my kid, not my kid. So there's all this kind of that push and pull there as well. That is sort of a dynamic you have to be cognizant of. But the more education we can provide, the better off we're all going to be. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Dr. Stone, but you know, I'm a big proponent on teaching people. And the more we talk about, by the way, the more we talk about mental health. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this seminar was because our generation, or my generation, as I mentioned earlier, it still has that stigma. The younger generation is not so much. And I think the more we talk about it, the more aware people are going to be of it. And the more it's going to be okay and more accepting in society. And I think that's a big hurdle we have to get over. I feel confident because the fact that the younger generations are more accepting and more aware of it, that I think there's real hope for us in the future. I really do.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right about that. And I've always described it kind of this way. It's like if my brain thinks there's a problem with my knee, my brain's going to say, well, get your knee fixed. If my brain thinks that there is a problem with my heart, my brain is going to say, okay, get your heart fixed. If somehow my brain gets the idea that there's something wrong with it, it frequently will say, no, you're not coming in here. Everything is fine inside here, okay? But if your toe hurts, we'll fix your toe. So there is this different way that our brain just, whether it will allow us to ever think about it the way that we think about our, knee again. I have no idea, but 100% right. Talking about it more, creating solutions for it more, and then trying to find that delicate balance between talking about it and it being acceptable without it being thought of as something that doesn't need to be treated or shouldn't be treated. And there's some delicate balance there that I see with a lot of people, and where I will sometimes, there's one condition that is referred to as a borderline personality disorder, for example. And somebody with a borderline personality disorder historically is going to, and again, personality is another entity all in and of itself. Personality is really the invisible thing that sort of lives simultaneous with the rest of us, but it kind of helps us to figure out what is our place in the world, how do we navigate this world safely. And its job, or it is it's adopted the belief that its job is to guide us now, or protect us. So sometimes it will guide us and protect us in ways that are not healthy for us. So somebody with a borderline personality disorder, for example, is going to have a lot of emotional turmoil, a lot of fear about relationships, but also a lot of need. And so those are folks who oftentimes you will hear about cutting on themselves or burning themselves with cigarettes, screaming at the top of their lungs at somebody to get the hell out of, my house, but then 4 minutes later is running down the street after the car saying, come back, come back, come back, because of all of the discomfort that gets created inside of them. We have two people in our life who wrestle with borderline personality disorder, and that's one of the reasons why that's also another area or another condition that is very close to my heart. The one of the hardest things that they wrestle with is saying, well, it's okay that I did this because I have borderline personality disorder. So it works sometimes as an explanation for behavior, and helping them to kind of understand it's an explanation for behavior, but it's not necessarily a behavior that you want to continue to display or demonstrate. That's a tough challenge for a lot of folks. But helping people to understand that they don't have to be ashamed of something is huge. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of that stigma starting to kind of melt away. And I don't think that there could be anything that could be better at improving mental health treatment going forward than a melting away of that stigma.
Yeah, I'm from the Center for Behavioral Neuroscience here. And so a lot of the issues you're talking about, I know it's a struggle to try to intervene. But scientists, of course, are working on some of the same things. And I sometimes get the impression that we're not communicating very well with policymakers, legal experts, and also sometimes people who are physicians. Will this course deal with that issue about how we can have sound science generate or produce sound policies that might actually affect some of the issues that you mentioned?
Yeah, so in my second class, we're going to do a more deeper dive into policy side as well as the private sector side and how they're working together or not working together. I just got confirmed the former Secretary of Health from Pennsylvania will be our guest speaker, and she worked both in the public sector and the private sector, so she's going to be able to give us a unique perspective. And of course, science would be a part of that as well. So that will be class number 2 on March 7th. So hopefully that will answer some of your questions. I think we have time for one more, and then I think we've got to let Dr.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just curious, the statistics you read and then the story you shared about your son at a university, and obviously we're here at AU, and then the doctor working for the prison system. What's the business or economic model of these? I mean, it sounds like the need is high, and I just wonder how these institutions are coming up with the resources and the capacity to address it. I mean, is it realistic to think that a school like AU or Villanova or any other has enough counselors, advisors, folks in their student health services that are looking for flags and troubleshooting and treating, or likewise in the penal situation? Is it realistic that they have enough money to get the care that's necessary?
So that's a really good question. I don't know to answer that question. I don't know if they have enough money. I know money is scarce. I know from a federal perspective, there's been legislation as recently when I was in Congress, we passed legislation that was giving grants from the federal government to states to help in the schools and that kind of stuff. Is it enough money? I don't think there's ever enough money for that. I don't know, Dr. Stone, you might have some insight on that question as well.
Well, a little bit, but probably about as much as, I mean, I suspect that this kind of like I do, that a lot of the money that gets funded into at least California, the state prison system in California, has come from federal lawsuits. And so when inmates, I don't know what year, go back 20 years or something like that, weren't getting the care. At some point in time, there were some lawsuits that came about. There's one called Coleman, and because of that, the state was really forced to fund mental health services more. That is a very, very crude description of it. I mean, mine is a very crude description of it. The details are far beyond what I could ever explain. But that's where the source of the money comes from. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because I don't know how willing people are. I mean, an average taxpayer, I don't know how willing somebody is to put tax money into mental health services. I think it would be a very interesting thing to find out for an average family, how much of their tax burden would they want to go into mental health services. And I don't know that question could ever really be answered, but I suspect that there's some kind of a push and pull relationship between that and probably a barrier. But again, I would say exactly the same thing. And in so many ways, there's never enough never enough counselors, never enough psychiatrists, never enough psychologists, as long as they are good counselors, good psychologists, and good psychiatrists.
Well, thank you. It's the top of the hour, and we want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Stone, you were fantastic. Thank you.
My pleasure. Glad it helped. Thank you all. Good luck with everything. I probably will sneak into some of these seminars from time to time when I can.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Good afternoon. All right. And that concludes. If anybody has any last questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Just in relation to when talking about whether it's realistic to have counselors or specific positions identify the question. I'm just curious because the prevalence of a lot of those mental disorders that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, is there a solution to, instead of taking extra money to fund these, to actually integrate some of those general preventative strategies to train students to be more resilient in adverse situations? Instead of like, maybe it's naive to say, but the mindset of paying extra to just allocate some of the money that's already being allocated to just train everyone how to deal with unpredictable situations in school or in community.
Well, I think you're seeing more and more of that today. I mean, back when I was in school, we didn't have any of that, but you're seeing a lot more effort, I think, today in the schools because they're dealing with so much more than they used to in the past. I mean, this is sort of evolving. To even think that we're talking as much about mental health today, you wouldn't have had 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't have had a class like this. I mean, maybe you did, but I wouldn't have been willing to talk about it. I can tell you that much. So society is evolving. And as the more knowledge that we get, the better off we're going to be. And we're going to start to see more integration like that, I believe.
It'd be interesting for your next guest, who was the HHS
Secretary
of Pennsylvania, to ask, because oftentimes budget shows values on some of
Exactly.
this, right? So like, how would they break down that budget to reflect how they're tackling those issues?
That would be a good question.
I'm not totally sure how to ask this, but like, obviously as people, we want to respect others, like, you know, capacity to rationally think, and we want to respect their consent. And I think it's particularly challenging as like an adult too, who's as like a parent. Where do you, is there a line when you're like, I need to intervene it, and I need to intervene even though they think it's a bad idea? Or do you only intervene in like really awful circumstances? Or do you just have to like let that person struggle a lot and you kind of just have to still be there?
So that's a really good question. And speaking from experience, I will tell you that you want your kids to learn to fail and pick themselves back up. And so how, you know, what's that fine line as to they got to figure it out themselves. And that's what we were doing with our son when he started going down, spiraling down. In fact, I remember I traveled from DC out to school to Pennsylvania, and when Dr. Stone talked about Nirvana, this is when I knew my kid had to go to that psych ward. He started talking about Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, and he started singing the songs, and I'm like, who are you? I mean, it was like, and his apartment was a mess, and he wasn't, you know, cleaning it up. And it got to a point where I knew something had to be done, but I wasn't sure exactly how to do it. And what the final straw for him was when he got arrested for public intoxication. He had come out of a bar and he was just, you know, he was loopy, and he got popped and ended up in jail. And I saw the video in jail, and I made him watch it. And right then we knew that was it. He was hitting rock bottom. So I don't think a person really wants to change until they're ready to make that commitment. Because it was a big commitment for my son. I mean, he was in a fraternity. He had to basically step back from all the social life. He had to really focus. He was young. He wanted to have a good time. And so it was really up to him to finally decide. And what finally triggered it was that night he was alone in the psych ward, and he was like by himself. And so it's a difficult, I guess if you had it was a $64 million question, you know, what's the answer? Yeah. There is no answer. You just have to, you know, figure out when the timing is right.
This is multi-part, but when we talk about definitions and how do you define this, I feel like all of us are walking around with our own definitions in hand, you know, causing some of these clashes of, you know, what is this, what is that?
Right.
But my question that I've tried to formulate is, are these events that we see, these mass shootings, these mental health crises, everything on the news, that we as a society have this tendency to, you know, post, have condolences, attend these events, are they helping solve I mean, it's not helpful so far. Yeah. We've seen the Memphis shooting. We've seen, of course, California. And it seems like this pattern. Do you think what we're doing in mental health today is a step to breaking that pattern and preventing someone from reaching their last straw and having backup straws?
So I think it's twofold. One is the positive news about social media, which is why we hear everything and we know everything, is that you're much more informed today. Social media makes everybody more informed. But the drawback is you're more informed, right? So now all of a sudden, it's like in everybody's face of what's happening. And so although we're more aware of it, we feel like there's so much more of it. And I don't know, statistically speaking, if there is really more of it. I mean, we have a bigger population than we ever did, you know, are the percentages higher? I don't know if the percentages are higher today than they were 25, 30 years ago, something I would go back and check. But we have to navigate the social media. And as much as technology is great, it definitely has its drawbacks. And we're learning. I mean, We're constantly learning. Society's constantly learning. Yeah.
Thank you. So you just provided a partial answer. I've kind of been ruminating on this for a little bit, but as much as this like seems innate, like, is there an extent, or are you aware of whether there's truly been a shift, especially among young people, from physical environmental causes of mental health to digital environmental causes of mental health, with anxiety, depression, mood disorders, perhaps even, you know, impulse control, suicidal ideation, with that stuff? You know, like, I was high school class of 2024. It was bad before COVID. It's really bad now.
Yeah.
So that's the
change. Is there been a shift? I don't know that there's been a shift, but you definitely, the digital side definitely plays into this 100%. You know, you hear about young teenage girls and Instagram. There's a big problem with Instagram, and you know, they get all consumed in, you know, do people like me? How do I look? And that's the future. I mean, we didn't have that when I grew up, but you guys have that. And you know, how do we deal with that as society? Because as you all get older and start having your own children, you're going to be faced with this when you're your 2-year-olds walking around with their phone in their hand, you know, and doing the right thing. I mean, this is reality, but this is life. And this is something that we're going to have to figure out how to navigate. And that's why I think having the conversations, talking about it, trying to destigmatize mental health illness, and say this is you know, normal in society, and how do we treat it, is all going to help us be better off in the long run.
Awesome. Wow, look at that.
Okay. Guys, this was fun.
Yes.
My inaugural class. Thank you very much.
The first time I was a professor.
I told some of you, I told my kids they had to call me Professor Walters.
Well, we appreciate you coming, and she will be here 3 more times on campus with us. If you're interested in more of her sessions or any of our other fellow sessions, we have this pamphlet and scan the QR code. We have Terry Samuels from NPR here tomorrow with the Pulitzer Prize winner, so that should be really exciting at the same time in this room. So check it out and register. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you.